and drop what you're doing and go pick up this series. I promise you'll love it. And I want you to say thank you. I want you to say, Matt, you were right. Hey everybody, it's Matt from Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, and we are back with another episode in the countdown of the best 100 fantasy books of all time. Today we're going to be going through number 60 through 51, and this is the episode where it really starts getting super good. I think this is the defining mark where these books are like the top of my 5 stars. If I could give 6 stars, these are the 60 books that would get them. These are going to be entirely spoiler free. If you ever want to hear spoilers and talk to me about spoilers, come join the Discord. There's a link down in the description. Click on that, come join. I'm always around, would love to chat, and we have cake and cookies, so you gotta try that. So let's start with number 60, and this is gonna be Knife of Dreams by Robert Jordan. This was written in 2005, and this is book number 11 of 15 in the Wheel of Time. So this book is very famous for being the last Robert Jordan book. If you're not familiar, Robert Jordan sadly passed away after this book was written, and Brandon Sanderson, who I'm sure you know about, came in and wrote the final 3 books in the series to finish it out, and I think he did a wonderful job. But this book is also popular for being the first book that recovered from the slog. Well, what's the slog? The slog is what a lot of people reference as 3 books, books number 8, 9, and 10 in the series, that were noticeably slower than the other books and a little harder to get through because they didn't have those major action sequences that we're used to, and it just felt a little bit different. I personally think the only really bad one of the bunch was the 10th book, Crossroads of Twilight, but a lot of people think that the 2 before that were not great as well. I just don't happen to agree with it. But this book was fantastic. This book is so good. It might be my favorite Robert Jordan book. I just loved it, and I loved it for a number of reasons. The first is that while this was the first book out of the slog, it made me appreciate the 3 books that came before this, because it was just a lot of setup for this book. You know, it didn't wrap up the story. They still needed 3 more books to really wrap up this story, but there were so many plot threads that Robert Jordan had investigated and built up to be these major things that we never got this huge satisfaction from, that really got satisfied here. There's so much action. There's so much from the characters that I love the most. One of them being Matt. Now, I know my name is Matt, so I'm a little predisposed to love that character, but I think that a lot of non-Matts also love this Matt. And he's just awesome. He's one of my favorite characters in all of fantasy. You come to grow to love this character over time. You start off not super into this character. They don't rub me the right way, at least personally. But after you fall in love with this character, you just can't wait to read more characters that star this character. And this book had a lot of him in it. But yeah, I just love so much. I love a big setup. I'm kind of a fan of the classic fantasy move of a slow build towards an epic conclusion. And this is like the definition of it. I mean, it was 3 books of setup after setup after setup and delayed gratification. And it finally came. And I just love that so much. Now, this book also, when I think about this book, and it's been a while since I've read it, it's so bittersweet. Because while this book was fantastic, it's so sad that this is the last book that Robert Jordan got to write. It's sad that this author didn't get to finalize their whole vision for this story. Although I'm sure that, you know, if he was to be able to look at what happened here, I think he'd be impressed with what Brandon Sanderson was able to accomplish. And it is just a very bittersweet kind of look back on this, because at least for me, I come to have adored Robert Jordan as I read through this, and I read these books well after they had already come out. But to read it and to know that I'll never be able to get to read another Robert Jordan book again was just kind of sad. But yeah, this is just such a good book. If you are in the middle of the slog and you're finding it hard to get through, I really think you need to just push through. I don't like to be kind of a pushy, you know, you must do X, but I really think you have to do yourself a favor. You've invested so much time up to that point. You've probably read, you know, 7,000 or so pages, 8,000 pages, that, you know, just push on through it and get through because this book is special and the rest of the series is special. And it ends in such a satisfying, it may not be the greatest ending of all time for people. It was fantastic for me. I love the ending to The Wheel of Time, and I don't want to get nitpicky and say, it could have been a little bit better. It was a great ending. I don't have a lot to complain about. And so push through. I think you owe it to yourself. Number 59 is Men at Arms. This is by Sir Terry Pratchett, written in 1993. And this is book number 15 of 39 in Discworld. And within Discworld, there's a lot of sub-series where you don't have to read. In fact, I don't recommend that you read all these books in perfect order starting from the beginning, but read a series at a time that follow a set of characters. This book is the second of 8 of the City Watch series. And the City Watch series, I think you'll find that 90% of people that will ever tell you to read Discworld will tell you that this is their favorite of the series. And oh man, was Men at Arms a wonderful book. I think that this book is well in the running for the funniest book of all time. Now, most books that I say are funny. And when I say that, what I mean is they made me smile, they made me chuckle, and there were a couple times where, I might have audibly laughed. This one legitimately had me laughing out loud in tears. I recall reading this book at night and my wife multiple times looking over at me and asking me what is wrong with you? Because I was just honestly, crying from laughter. It's so good. And it's not just that the jokes hit home, which they do. They're poignant. They have this depth to them. They're smart and witty. And it's not just this slapstick humor, which I do enjoy from time to time, but it's just very intelligent humor. And not highbrow either. You'll have to read it to really understand what I mean, but it's wonderful, and very, very few authors have ever been able to achieve what Terry Pratchett was able to achieve here. And this is book, he is just at his peak here. It did take Terry Pratchett a little bit of time to get to this point. I thought that his first handful of books were just okay. I thought the next handful of books were good. But this is where I think he really hit his stride. And I wouldn't say that it started here. I'd have to really go back and research and figure out where I thought that it just finally got to that high level that we all expect Terry Pratchett to be at. But I can confidently say that he was absolutely here when this book came out. I always find that Pratchett stories are always good. But what makes them stand out, what makes them great, is the dialogue and the characters. And in this book, they are just top tier. In part in this book because the characters were not just repeat characters. In the first book in the City Watch series, we're introduced to 4 main characters. You have these members of the City Watch. You have these 3 long-standing City Watch members and this new one who comes along. And the story, in large part, is about the integration of this new character. And that new character is Carrot. And he is a 6-foot-tall dwarf. Obviously, he's adopted. And he is finding his way. He's so truthful and wants to do the right thing that it's hard for him to join this band of misfits when he joins. And the Watch is just at a low. They constantly are trying to get out of doing their job. They're ringing a bell as they go around town because they want criminals to realize to stay away from them. They're so bad at their jobs. In that book, it's getting reformed to be a real force of nature. In this book, they've achieved a lot of good things, and now they're at a point where they are hiring and they're expanding the Watch in a big way. But they're not just expanding and getting anybody. It's a fun satire on affirmative action. And in this world, in this fantasy world of Discworld, affirmative action means they're hiring a dwarf, they're hiring a troll, and they're hiring a werewolf. And it's these dynamics of these characters coming in, particularly, I think the dwarf and the troll and their dynamic together, because they have the classic trope, and Terry Pratchett's really famous for playing with classic tropes and trying to put a new spin on them. But the classic antagonism that dwarves and trolls have with each other very much persists in this world. But to watch them team up and have this amazing dialogue with each other is just so top tier. You know, I can't tell you what makes this book funny because I can't put into words. I don't have the genius that Terry Pratchett has just coming off here and spitting off the cuff about what makes it so good. But I'll give you one small example. It's that there's one of the main characters believes that the werewolf was hired because they're a woman, because that's the affirmative action, the classic affirmative action. That's the play on it. But they don't realize that it's actually a werewolf. And so they're oblivious to this fact, and they're treating this character with this care and this delicacy because they think they're a woman, and that's the reason. And it's such a fun spin on integrating what we know about affirmative action in today's world and mixing it with this amazing fantasy element. And it's just, you have to give this series a shot. Start with Guards. I believe, and I think a lot of people believe, it's the greatest starting point for Discworld. So if you're at all intrigued on having an amazing time and laughing your butt off, go pick up Guards. It's a relatively short read. You know, it's only a few hundred pages. You'll breeze through it. I think you'll have a blast, and it'll get you really hooked on Discworld. Number 58, and oh man, I'm so excited I get to talk about this book with you. This is Malice by John Gwynne. This book was written in 2012. This is book 1 of 4 of The Faithful and the Fallen, and this is where it all started. This is where John Gwynne began his epic journey to turn into my second favorite author of all time. And the first favorite author of all time, you're going to read a lot more about him as we get further on into this series. Now, let's talk about John Gwynne. How is somebody capable of churning out a book like this on their first try? You're supposed to fail miserably when you write a book for the first time. Brandon Sanderson, he wrote a bunch of books that didn't get picked up for publication. And then his first book that he got published was Elantris. And if you love Elantris, credit to you. I did not. It's my least favorite Sanderson book that I've ever read. It struggles for me. You know, you look at like a Robin Hobb. You know, I don't think Assassin's Apprentice was as good as this. You look at even Steven Erikson. You know, Gardens of the Moon, I don't think was as good as this. I can't think of many authors that have been able to do this. And you got a question like, man, you should have been writing way before this, because he wasn't exactly like a young man when he wrote this book. And it's just incredible to me. And I think it should be such an inspiration to authors to be able to see, you know, what maybe you have in you and are able to get out there. But this is just amazing. This is a classic epic fantasy story. And what I mean by classic is it has so many of these old school things with kind of a new twist on them, or at least doing them to perfection. You know, this is a multi-POV, epic, big fantasy in a big sprawling world. It's a good versus evil story. It doesn't pretend that it's anything but that. And I like gray. I love gray. I like grimdark. I like it when characters are bad or you can't tell. This book is not that. What you're getting here is essentially angels versus demons, and it's a lot more complicated than that, but that is the central premise to this story. But I like that every now and then. I want sometimes this simplicity to my stories that allows me just to sit back kind of in a more cozy mindset and just take a fun, awesome, epic story. You know, one of the things that I severely loved about this series is that not only does it tell this story, but it tells it from both sides. You get plenty of point of view sides to the bad side of things. And it's so fun to be able to read it because it humanizes them more. Because these people that it gives the point of view from, in large part don't realize that they're bad, or they're going down this bad path, and you almost feel sorry for them that this is happening. And I love having compassion. I think compassion is such an amazing theme that fantasy is so famous for. It's one of the things that keeps bringing me back. And to be able to have the reader show compassion for bad characters is a very important thing for making stories really go from good to great. And that's one of the reasons this book goes from good to great. This book, I mentioned it's this angels versus demons thing, and you can surmise that essentially what this means is that it plays with a lot of religious themes, but it does them in an amazing way. It's one of the best takes on religion that I've ever read in any fantasy book, in that it puts this idea in your head of what you know to be true about this religion, and it constantly flips it on itself and makes you question what you knew, and then question what you now think you know, and then question it even further. You know, there's twists that go in this story that are monumentally mind-blowing. And I've always said that the hallmark of a good twist is when you read it, you say, oh, now I want to go back and read these books again. Because you get like a 2-for-1. You get the second time you read, you don't have to go through the same thing again. Now you have this knowledge about these major events that give you a totally different perspective on the events that preceded it. And this is one of those books. I can't ever talk about John Gwynne also without talking about the battle sequences. He is the best of the best. You will never read battle sequences in a fantasy book that are able to achieve the scale, the specificity, the epicness, and the clarity that John Gwynne is able to do. You know, he somehow is able to combine this ability of taking these grand, epic, huge scale moments that should be hectic, and they are hectic, but telling them in such a vivid way that as the reader, you're able to say, I can perfectly picture what's happening, and it sticks in your brain forever. Now, I am a big fan of like Joe Abercrombie, and Joe Abercrombie's battle sequences I think are magnificent. But as time goes, I find that I don't remember them with the clarity that I do the John Gwynne ones. And I find being able to remember things is an important part to how good they are, because that means they were written really well, or they're just so memorable. So I will say that I find this to be a good thing, but you might find this to be a bad thing. Because I hear this often, and I've heard people talk in my Discord channel, which again, come join, it's a great time, let's talk about books. But I've heard people say, you know, when does this book get good? And I always struggle when I hear that, because I think what people mean when they say that is, when does the action start? And it's hard for me to talk about that because I don't necessarily view good or bad about how much action something has. I think action, and I mentioned this earlier in my video, is I think action works best when you get this buildup of tension and then it finally pops off. You know, I would much rather have a big action sequence be at the tail end of a lot of buildup than I would be to have the book come right out of the gates with a huge battle, make things epic just for the sake of being epic. It doesn't work as well for me. Now, maybe it does work in some instances, and I've read certainly plenty of books that go off like that, and they're entertaining. But I like it this way, and this book has a lot of slow build. So if that's something that you worry about, I still think the series is for you. This is a 4-book series. And then there's 3 more books in a following trilogy that's in the same world with some of the same characters, and that you gotta read if you like the first one. Why would you not read the next one if you love the first one? And not a lot of people have, and that bothers me. And I just talked about that in the last video that I released. But it takes a while for the action to start. Now, when the action starts, it's probably towards the 2/3 mark, or maybe a little bit later. I don't know exactly. It's been a little while since I've read this. It pops off in an amazing way, and it makes the ending of this book wonderful. But it also sets the stage for the rest of the books to be able to have a much quicker pace, because all this buildup in the character development that was needed was already done in this first book. So keep on going. I would not give up on this series until you finish the first book. If you finish the first book and you said, yeah, I'm not really feeling it, I don't think this is for you, and that's fine. Not every book is for every person. But yeah, I do suspect, though, that you're going to love the ending to this book. And if you do, you're going to absolutely be floored by books 2, 3, and 4. Number 57 is A Feast for Crows by George R.R. Martin, written in 2005. This is book 4 of probably going to be 7 A Song of Ice and Fire books, but currently there's only 5 out. We'll see if even the 6th one gets written, let alone the 7th one. But that's another story for another time. This book I think, is incredible. I love so much About a Feast for Crows, and I don't think you'd find a ton of people that have this book written as high as I have this book, but this book really, really worked for me. Now, I'm a huge A Song of Ice and Fire fan. It really rekindled my love for fantasy. I watched the first episode of Game of Thrones and I said, whoa, hold up, this is awesome. I went and read all of the books that were out, and then I came back to finish up the show because it blew my mind at how good it was. Now, this book gets a lot of criticism, and I want to go through and talk about that criticism a little bit before we talk about the things that I did like. And that criticism really centers around a couple things. One is it took a long time for this book to come out. I think it was like 4 or 5 years. Now, in retrospect, that's not a lot of time because we've been way longer from the ending of the 5th book till now, and who knows when the 6th book's going to come out. Again, probably never. But there was a lot of time in between those. Now, when they got the book, it didn't have the major action sequences that people were used to. It didn't have those wow, boom moments. And so to wait a long time to get a book and then not get wowed by these major events can really sour people. And I think that's a lot of what people got soured with the Robert Jordan books, to a lesser degree, because those books came out a little bit quicker, I believe. But this book also is arguably a lower quality than the first 3 books. And I don't even know if it's arguably. I think it's unarguably. I think almost everybody would say that books 1, 2, and 3 were better than books 4 and 5. And I agree with that, but I still think this book is awesome. And spoiler alert, you're going to see books 1, 2, and 3 later on in this list. But yeah, I don't think it's the disappointment that people make it out to be. Now, I think this is a running theme for this week's videos, in that I don't mind a slower book. I kind of like it sometimes. I like taking a pause from the action and being able to get some introspection with these characters. Now, this book's different in that it's the 4th book and it goes slow. But I do thoroughly enjoy, I thought books 1, 2, and 3 were high octane. So really, to get this book that is a big breather, and you get a lot of character development. I love character development. I don't want to talk about which characters got major character development because I think that's a little bit of a spoiler. And I don't know if I can really spoil this book for people because I think almost everybody has watched the show, and a lot of this book was in the show. And so, but for those that didn't, I don't want to say, but there's a couple characters that really changed who they are and who they want to be in this book. One real notable one, and if you've read the books, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I love that growth, and this book got a lot of it. I think another reason that people didn't love this book was there were some notable absences in this book, because books 4 and 5 occur roughly at the same time. In fact, a lot of people would tell you to read books 4 and 5 at the same time. There's reading orders that you can do where it's like, read chapters 2 and 3 from A Feast for Crows, and then read chapter 1 of A Dance with Dragons. And, it does a lot of that stuff where you could, it happens at the same time and you can figure it out and how to match these up. I don't think you should do it like that. I think you should do it in publication order. But it means that some notable characters are missing from this book. The 3 notable ones are Dany, Tyrion, and Bran. Now, Dany and Tyrion are major, major fan favorites. So to have them not here is a big deal. But I also like that we got a much bigger focus on some other characters, namely Cersei, Brienne, Jaime, and Littlefinger. They are the stars of this book. And I think a lot of people don't love some of these characters, namely Cersei and Brienne. I've heard a lot of hate about those 2 characters, not so much because they just hate who they are, although Cersei, that's very true, but because they don't feel like there's enough character growth in them, or that the growth that they had was not the direction they thought they would go. Cersei's not a good person, and she's so jaded and lives so high up in her own head and these delusions of grandeur, and it can grate on people. But I love Cersei, and looking back on it, she's probably my favorite character in the entire series because of how much of a tragic character this is. And when you learn her backstory, at least for me, I have a lot of sympathy for this character because, I believe that I understand why she is who she is, and that a lot of people, whether they want to admit it or not, would probably turn into what she turned into if they had to undergo the trauma that she had to go through. And so I have a lot of sympathy for this character, and I love learning more about them. You know, I did think that this book had a lot of character development, a lot of mysteries, a lot of intrigue, and that's a lot of the reason that I love A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, it's true that there was no big epic confrontation in this book, and I did find that to be the weakest part of this. I would have loved the ending to this book to have popped off, you know, similar to the way that Malice popped off, a book that we just talked about. It didn't happen, and that's ultimately what brings this book much lower down in my rankings than I think it should be. If it ended in this major conglomeration of events that just really, you know, blew things up, this book would be so top tier for me. But the fact that it didn't means it's number 57. Number 56 is A Time of Blood, and this is by John Gwynne, written in 2019. This is part of Blood and Bone, and this is book 2 of 4. And like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Malice, this series can really be looked at as 2 different series. You have the quartet of The Faithful and the Fallen, and then you have this trilogy, and it's of Blood and Bone, and they are set in the same world with some of the same characters talking about similar events with a huge time jump in between them. And so if you love the first one, I think you're gonna love the second one too. And this book is where the series really got good for me. Now, I gave every single book in the series a 5 out of 5, except for the first book in this series. I think I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. And the major reason I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 was that it was a way tighter story, and that it didn't have the sprawling epic fantasy. It was only about a couple characters set in one tiny part of the map, dealing with much smaller events. And I spent most of the book wondering, what's happening here? Why are we going so slow? I like slow. We've talked about it a lot in the video, but that was really painfully slow. And I didn't even know where the plot was going until the very end. And I felt like it needed to be a grander story for really me to get sucked into these characters, and it didn't happen. Now, the ending of the book was fantastic, and it's what saved the book in large part for me. But this book, you already know the characters, you're intimately familiar with them, and events are really getting to a big turning point. And I loved it. You know, I thought that this book was just better in every single way. It's back to perfection, and I love that. It needed no setup. You know, it had the things that I love of John Gwynne books. You know, it had huge battles, it had mythic beasts, and I gotta tell you, I'm a major sucker for huge mythic beasts. The bigger, the badder, the better for me. It had unexpected twists, and I'm a sucker for those too. So this book was tailor-made for somebody like me. You know, it did have this tighter scope. It did have this reduced cast. It did have these much smaller locations. You know, it really took place in like 1 or 2 locations. That's it. But I appreciated it for what it was. And now that I knew the characters so well and I could appreciate them for what they were, I thought it was just awesome. Now, this book had the battle at the end of this book was so good that it would have been a fitting end to an amazing trilogy. And this is a middle book. There is no middle book syndrome here with this book. This book just completely threw that trope out the window. And it's a common thing that happens in fantasy books. Mistborn, I'm looking at you. And a lot of other books. I don't just mean to pick on Mistborn. But man, it is just so good. I can remember every single little thing that happened in that battle. And I cherish my reading experience that I was allowed to go on that journey that John Gwynne led me down. Now, this series is a lot more gray than Faithful and the Fallen. It's almost like the palette of the world has gotten darker. You know, events are bleaker, and you know, you can't quite tell if there's good guys, if there's bad guys, if the good guys are really bad, if the bad guys are really good, is there somewhere in between? And I like that a lot. Now, I love both of those styles, but I thought it was really cool that John Gwynne was able to bridge that gap and was able to go from this one style, the classic good versus evil, and then move to this more modern style of a more confusing gray atmosphere. And that's really cool. I also really thoroughly enjoyed, and I know it didn't start in this book, but I don't get to talk about the first book in this series because it's not on this list. So I'm going to talk about it now. But time jumps can be a very difficult thing for an author to pull off. Now, some authors have pulled them off very well. You know, I think that Joe Abercrombie was able to do it very well with The First Law, between the first trilogy and the second trilogy. I think that Fonda Lee was able to accomplish it extremely well within her Greenbone Saga series, where there were major time jumps within each of those books. Now, but this series decided to go from, you know, these major events, like a 150-year gap, to these events. And that's not an easy thing to pull off. And John Gwynne just absolutely nailed it. So please pick up A Blood and Bone. Not nearly enough people have read this. I talked about this recently in a recent video, and I think it was exemplified. There was a comment on my YouTube page that said, I am one of those people. I love Faithful and the Fallen, and I just never quite picked up this series. What? Do it. Just go get this series. It's so good. You'll love it. Number 55 is Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is written in 2003, and this is book 9 of 16 in the realm of the Elderlings. Now, within the realm of the Elderlings, there are 5 different sub-series, and this is book 3 of 3 of the Tawny Man trilogy. Now, I love so much about this book, and I feel really bad that I'm ranking this at 55, you know, because I just feel in my heart that it could be so much higher, but there's a lot of good books on this list, and I got to make some tough decisions. But what I love so much about this book is that it wrapped up such a meaningful story to me in such a great way. I'm a really big sucker for the last book in a series, if it can do it well. And this book just did it so good. Now, The Tawny Man in general is a special trilogy for me because of this huge time jump that happened between when we got to see Fitz in the first trilogy until now. It's been a long time. And it's not so much the time jump itself that was meaningful to me, it's how Fitz has progressed into this older man. You know, he's, you know, an older adult at this point who's gone through so much trauma, and he's trying to bounce back, and he gets sucked into court life again to go on this grand adventure. Now, I thought the first 2 books of The Tawny Man were good, very good. This one was incredible. I wasn't sure where those first 2 books were really going. Now, in the first book kind of felt like it could have been its own individual story. You could read it as a standalone almost. The second book was really just a lead up into this one. And this one, it just fired off. You know, I talked about the second book. If it wasn't last week, it was the week before. But it really just felt like a huge setup. And what the big excitement that I got from that book was ending that book knowing that, oh man, this is where that third book is going. And it's finally there. Now, I can't bring up a Robin Hobb book without talking about the character writing that she does. She's the best. And I don't know that anybody will ever be able to accomplish what she has been able to accomplish in this 16-book series. Every single character that's written is the most human, the most relatable. Even if they're horrible people, that you can relate to them, you understand their motivations, you care about them. Sometimes you care about them getting their quick demise, but you get such intense human emotions from these characters. The dialogue is so good. The development is so good of these characters. And it's so well done. The slow plot turning into this huge epic quest. And I wish I could say more about what that quest is, but I don't want to ruin a single thing about this book other than saying it just pops off in this book. And I will always remember the imagery and the locations that we get to investigate in this timeline getting wrapped up, and the way that it ties in with the first series in a very important arc going on in the first series, and we get to see all this, and the grand story is getting developed. It's just so magical. There's a reason that so many people have this book so highly rated. It does so many things right. And yeah, I mean, I don't think I got to convince you to keep reading the series, because I think if you're kind of getting to the Tawny Man, you know, you're in for an amazing ride, and you've already went through some amazing books, so you're probably going to keep going. But if you have not read Realm of the Elderlings, I could not encourage you to go pick up Assassin's Apprentice. Keep your expectations a little bit limited, because that book is not the greatest thing in the world. Just know that you are in for an amazing ride with some amazing characters that you will cherish for the rest of your life. Number 54 is Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, written in 2007. This is book 2 of 9 in the First Law universe, and book 2 of 3 of the first trilogy. And this book was just an improvement upon the first book in virtually every single way. And I love that first book. Joe Abercrombie is just such an incredible writer, and this series is just magical. There's a big reason that so many people will say that this book and this series are in their top 10 of all time. In fact, almost everybody that you will ever watch in the booktube community will probably agree that the First Law is one of the greatest fantasy series that have ever been written. Now, I thought the first book had almost too many POVs that just didn't interconnect. It felt like a bunch of individual stories, none of which were crazy gripping. Now, it was setting the stage, and I loved that book a lot. But that was the downside in that book, is it spent a lot of time on all these individual characters, and it's like, where are we going in this story? I'm confident that it's going somewhere, but I don't see the grander vision yet. Now, this one tightened that up a lot. And while there are quite a few POVs in this series, now the story has turned into 3 main storylines. And I like that we got that tightening up of this story, and I thought that it improved its enjoyability monumentally. Now, in this series and in this book, every single character is a bad guy in their own way. I mean, this is not a story that you should be reading if you're looking for good versus evil, or you're looking for good at all. This is a series with a lot of bad people doing bad things, or good people that get sucked into doing bad things. You know, it's just constantly the running theme of this book. And if you're looking for like morally gray, you know, I think a lot of people would say this is the series for you, but this is like kind of morally black. Now, there's not too much just straight evil. You know, there is a little bit of that. You know, I don't want to really say who and what they do, but there is that aspect. But I think in general, you can think of this book as a lot of people that are just morally anywhere from ambiguous to bad. But they're all, virtually all, are just trying to do the right thing. Now, some of them are a little bit more ambiguous. But yeah, this is a dark, gritty, real world. And I love so much about how this story has been constructed. You know, I thought that there was not really a middle book syndrome here, because I thought the second book was better than the first book. But I did not enjoy the ending of this book. And that's a shame, because I think endings really tie a story together. And the ending here felt almost like a waste of time. It was like, it honestly was one of the more disappointing endings to a book that I've ever read. It was like, I feel like we've wasted a lot of time here. And what have we really accomplished? And, you know, I think in retrospect, I should have just appreciated the journey for what it is. Now, I love this story, but I love this story really about the characters and the way that they're written. I love the world. I love so much about the way that those things are constructed. The story here, I feel like, was not incredible. Now, the third book blows it up, and I am obsessed with the story of that third book. But yeah, I think you read this book for the characterizations and this dark world, and I love dark worlds, and this is just a hallmark for it. And yeah, I think if the ending really stuck the landing, this would be a top 10, top 15 book of all time, but that's why we're down in the 54 range. You know, I find that in this book, there are so many funny things that happen. Now, you might have heard what I just said about being in this dark world, but it is juxtaposed with this very funny character writing and dialogue. It's almost like worryingly relatable to these characters. And I find myself relating to them and thinking like, what does that say about me? But I obviously I'm not like some psychopath, obviously, right? Like we're cool. But yeah, these are very believable characters. And yeah, I definitely, if you're looking for great character writing, we just talked about Robin Hobb. She's the best. Joe Abercrombie, he's up there in the discussion. Number 53 is The Final Empire, written by Brandon Sanderson in 2006. This is book 1 of 3 of Mistborn Era 1. Now, Mistborn is split up into 2 eras. The first one is a trilogy, the second one is a quartet. That 4th book is coming out later this year. And then there will be 2 more that eventually get written. But you can look at these very individual. You don't have to read all of them to really understand the story here. They're loosely connected. This first trilogy is very special to me. I really loved this first book so much. I read this book immediately after I read Stormlight Archive, and I wasn't expecting a lot because I had heard from everybody that Stormlight Archive is the superior series, and I agree. So my expectations were really high for this. And as I read through this book, I was regretting it. I got to the first third of the book, and I thought, the writing's a little clunky, it's not as good, don't love the characters as much, the plot's slow. Got to the second third. My opinion had not changed at all. At heart, this was a heist story, and it's not hiding that fact throughout the book. And I thought, well, maybe when the heist kicks off, my opinion will change from this book. And oh man, I've never had a book in my life go from like such a low score to such a high score in such a short amount of time in the book. I was probably going to rate this book a 2, maybe a 3, before it turned into a very top tier 5 out of 5 for me. That's how good the ending of this book was. It's one of the best endings to a book that I've ever read. And I say that as a fan of last books in a series. This is the first book in this series, and it's magnificent. I thought it saved everything about it. I love the kind of darker urban setting here, and I haven't hidden the fact that I'm never really a huge fan of urban fantasy, but this is one of the exceptions. I thought that the urban setting was wonderful. I thought the magic system is the all-time great when it comes to magic systems. I still to date have never read one that I've been so compelled to want to learn more about and just fascinated by. Not so much about how the magic system takes place, the way that it works, but what the magic powers are so inventive. They're so crazy fun, and they interweave with the plot in such an amazing way. It's just so good. So the last third of this is jaw-dropping. The twists, and I say twists with a plural, because they are insane. They make you want to read this book again the moment you finish it. Now, I don't suggest you do that because the twists that get revealed later on in the series are even more mind-boggling. I will go down and say I think the twists that are in Mistborn are the greatest twists in all of fantasy. And they are what I will always remember most about this series and what makes it so special for me. So if you're looking for a book that is going to blow your mind, if you're looking for a book that is going to make you want to read it the second you finish it, this is the book for you, and this is the series for you. The writing, I don't think, is the top tier of fantasy, but the twists and the story and the way that it ends really, really is. Okay, so number 52 is Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. This is written in 1998, and this is the 4th of 16 books in the realm of the Elderlings. And before we were talking about the Tawny Man, which is the 3rd trilogy. This is the 2nd trilogy, and it's book 1 of 3, and it's called Live Ship Traders. And I think the majority of people would tell you that Live Ship Traders is the best that Realm of the Elderlings has to offer, and I am certainly in that boat. I think this is the weakest of the 3 books, and I'm ranking it as my 52nd best fantasy book of all time. This series just rocks. This is a fantasy naval pirate book. That's cool. I love pirates. I think they're so cool. I love naval stories. I think they're awesome. I love fantasy stories. You bring them all together to this incredible, incredible story. And you combine it with the Robin Hobb's ability to characterize people, and it's just magical. So you finished up the first trilogy, right? And it's about Fitz. It involves castles and lords and ladies and all these things. And then you pick up this book and it's like, what happened? Fitz isn't there. The castles are gone. All of a sudden, I'm reading a pirate story with totally different characters. And what are we doing here? Well, and that's what Realm of the Elderlings is really famous for. It jumps around and it tells these different stories, these different trilogies. The first, the third, and the fifth cover the same characters. The second and the fourth are kind of these individual different trilogies that really end up getting tied in. You're not going to realize they're getting tied in until the end of these books. But when it does all tie in, you're going to be wowed and it'll make sense. You know, as I was reading these, it felt like, did this story need to be told for this greater story? Yes, it absolutely did. And a lot of these characters are going to make repeat appearances later on in the series, and it's a very important. It's just, I love it. Now, I don't think, though, that you should start with this, even though you could. I think you would do best to go on this in chronological order. But, man, if you're reading Fitz in the first trilogy and you're like, yeah, I don't know that I love Realm of the Elderlings. Yeah, no. Read this, and push through and get here. And if you can't push through, then just read these. Because, man, it's so good. I think the magic elements of this book are so much better than what was in the rest of the Realm of the Elderling stories, because in the early one, you had these different magic components to it, and they're weak, in my opinion. The way they use magic is not super overpowering, and I don't need overpowering magic, but it's just not like so compelling to the plot, and I'm just not convinced by it so well, and it's one of the weaker magic systems. Now, I love all the books, but I think that's the weakest part of the books. Now, in this series, it's not at all. You find out within like the first chapter of this book that this world survives in people riding in ships, but really rich families can have these things called live ships. And what a live ship is the ship is literally living. The front mast of the ship, where you have like a woman, stretched out in the front of the ship, which a lot of I'm sure you could picture that. They're an alive wooden character with their own emotions and their feelings. They can direct the ship. They're talking to the crew. They feel everything that goes on. There's this component where the owners of the ship need to literally die on the ship to have all their memories seep into the ship and make it, have all of the memories from all the previous owners to really make the ship more powerful. And it's just so cool. For me, it's top tier fantasy. I think the plot here is crazy engaging, so much more engaging than the first trilogy. I love all of these characters. It left me in such wonder. Now, I hate that I have to rank this book down at 52. And I'm going to say that a lot. And I'm going to try not to say it a lot because I love all these books and it hurts me to rank something down at 52. But I have to keep reminding myself that just because you're down at 52 doesn't mean that I don't like you. But because I love it. I think the only bad thing about this book is that it's overshadowed by the next two books in this trilogy, which you're going to see how high I rated them. And it's number 51 is Jade City by Fonda Lee. This was written in 2017, and this is the first of the trilogy of the Greenbone Saga. And I'm obsessed with this book. I'm obsessed with this trilogy. Now, this is up here, and I read this book after I created my top 100, but I left 2 placeholders open in my top 100 for books that, I think I left 3 actually, for books that I was anticipating that I would find some books that would be amazing to me, that I would be able to fit in here. And luckily, I found 3. Now, I found more than 3, and now I'm sad about it, because ultimately, this book is my weakest of the trilogy, but it's the only one that's going to show up on this list. I already had everything set. I can't refigure it anymore. But know that when I do a repeat of this series and I do a 2023 update here, that you're going to find that this one is the lowest of the 3. And that's how important this is to me. So let me tell you a little bit about the Greenbone Saga if you have not read it yet. This in as few words as I can say, this is an Asian fantasy Godfather. That's what this is. You know, it has these very distinct Asian features to it, not just in the geography and what we're dealing with, but all the characters, their names have all these, you know, Asian pronunciations in the way that they're built, you know, with their last name being first, and it just has so much that reeks of that. And I love that. I really do enjoy when books try to drift away from the classic, you know, European kind of theme to it, because I've read so many of them that it's nice to have these differences in my fantasy books. You know, and I love The Godfather. The Godfather is one of my favorite books of all time. Now, it's not going to show up on this list because it's not a fantasy book, but if I had a top 10 of my favorite books of all time, The Godfather would be on that list. And I love that this book was able to take that as an inspiration and turn it into its own thing. And I just wish there were more fantasy books that tried to do a mafia, Godfather type thing, because it just worked so well here. Now, maybe a lot of people wouldn't be able to pull it off. Fonda Lee is an incredible writer, and she certainly knocked it out of the park. Now, I did find that the beginning of this book, it reeked too much like The Godfather, and it worried me because it felt like this was going to be like a Godfather ripoff. There are several scenes in the beginning of this book that scream to me, like, could you have just changed it a little bit? Because they were just identical, down to the composition of the family, to these major events that happen towards the beginning of the book. But very quickly, it starts to turn into its own thing. And as we're getting towards the end of this book, it very much took a sharp diversion, and it never looked back. And I never had that feeling again of, this is a Godfather remake. No, it's clearly the inspiration for this, but it did its own thing. The characters in this book are incredible. I liked them a lot in this book, but as I kept reading the series, now that I look back on it, I love them. I can't get enough of them. I love how real they are. I love that they don't have plot armor. You know, bad things can happen to them. I love that in my books when I don't know what to expect. That's a great aspect to a story for me. The writing is top tier. The world isn't great. You know, it's just a generic city. It's not amazing to me. I think the fantasy elements are not amazing either. You know, the main crux of the story is that characters can have jade that's mined, that if they fix it to their body and wear it with jewelry, certain people that are predisposed to having this ability can have superpowered, like, crazy martial arts skills. Stronger, faster, better at everything. You know, if you had the guy that was a jade warrior and they had a knife and they were going up against a regular person with a gun, they'd win every time. That's how powerful these abilities are. But they're not crazy used in this book. They get more used and more central to the story as we get later on. But what really makes this story stand out is the plot and the characters. They are top tier. And I suspect if you're watching this, you've probably already read these. These are kind of one of the big recent hits. You know, it's written in 2017, not that long ago. I think the most recent book, was written in 2021. And so you've probably read it. But if you haven't, get on that boat. Now, I will say that if you watch The Godfather and you're like, yeah, it was okay, you're not going to like this series. But if you watch The Godfather and you said it's either good or great, then drop what you're doing and go pick up this series. I promise you'll love it. And I want you to say thank you. I want you to say, Matt, you were right. But yeah, that's how I feel, and I am sticking to it. All right, so that wraps up this week. Next week, we are going to be going through numbers 50 through 41. If you enjoy this content, I would highly encourage you to subscribe so that you're able to get these videos as soon as they come out. If you want to chat about these or anything with me, please make a comment below or come join the Discord and we'll chat about it in real time. Thanks so much, and as always, happy reading to you.